The ball was still happening when I ran. I could hear the music even as I crossed the outer courtyard, the strings, the low drums, the sound of laughter carried on cold air like something mocking me. My slippers were wrong for the cobblestones. I had known that before I left my chamber, and I had not cared. I did not care now. I only knew that if I stayed inside those torchlit halls one more moment, surrounded by silk and perfume and eyes that looked through me as though I were made of glass, I would shatter in a way that no one in that kingdom would bother to sweep up. So I ran. The night was cold, the way only early spring could be in the highlands, sharp at the edges, carrying the smell of wet stone and pine resin and something older beneath it all, something that belonged to the earth before castles were built upon it. My gray wool cloak whipped behind me as I moved through the lower gate, past the sleepy guard who startled but did not stop me. I was, after all, no one important. An Omega without a house name. A girl brought to Castle Vordenmaar as a seamstress's assistant, which was a gracious way of saying I repaired torn hems and replaced missing buttons, and was never, under any circumstance, supposed to attend the Solstice Ball at all. I had attended it anyway. That had been my first mistake. Though if I was being honest with myself, and the cold night air had a way of forcing honesty, it had not truly been the first. I slowed when I reached the edge of the eastern wood. The torchlight from the castle walls fell in long orange bars across the ground, and beyond them was darkness, real darkness, the kind that breathed. I pressed my back against an old oak just outside the tree line and let myself stop, let myself breathe. My lungs ached from the running and from something else, something tighter and less easy to name. I had seen him look at me. That was the thing I could not explain, could not reason away, could not tuck behind practical thinking the way I usually tucked every inconvenient feeling. I had been standing near the far column, half hidden behind a hanging tapestry of the old wolf sigil, watching the lords and ladies move through their careful formations on the dance floor. I had not been invited. I had slipped in through the servants' passage because Marta, the head seamstress, had needed a last-minute repair done on Lady Seraphine's gown, and I had been the only one awake at that hour, and afterward, I simply had not left the way I was supposed to. I had stood in the shadows and watched the kingdom's finest pretend the world was uncomplicated. And then, across the length of that enormous hall, past the candelabras and the moving bodies, and the haze of incense smoke, King Draven had turned his head and looked directly at me. Not at the column, not at the tapestry, at me. I had seen King Draven before, the way all castle servants saw him, at a distance, in passing, as a silhouette moving through corridors with his guard at his back and his expression sealed as iron. He was tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller, with dark hair worn in thick braids pulled back from a face that seemed to have been carved without softness in mind. His eyes were pale, a gray so light it was nearly silver, and they were the kind of eyes that did not ask permission before they found what they were looking for. They had found me. I had lasted perhaps 4 seconds under that gaze before I turned and walked, very quickly, and then faster than that, toward the servants' passage, and through it, and out into the night. Now I stood with my back against an oak tree, my heart loud in my ears, and tried to decide what exactly I was afraid of. It was not him, not precisely. Or rather, it was not fear of what he would do. King Draven had a reputation for severity, for silence, for the kind of authority that did not need to raise its voice. The court feared him the way one fears a storm, not because it is cruel, but because it is vast and does not negotiate. But I had never heard a story of him harming someone without cause. What I felt was something more complicated than simple fear. What I felt was the specific terror of being seen when you have spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. I was good at being overlooked. I had learned it young, in the border village of Ashenwick where I was born, the third daughter of a wool merchant, Omega-born in a family of betas, which meant I was loved well enough, but quietly understood to be the one who would not inherit, would not lead, would not matter much in the larger arrangements of the world. I had come to Castle Vordenmaar at 22 with a needle case and a letter of introduction from a village elder who had taken pity on me, and I had spent the 2 years since making myself useful and small and unremarkable. It had worked. Until tonight, apparently. I pushed off from the tree and began walking along the wood's edge, not into it. I was not foolish enough for that. Not at night in the highlands, but parallel to the castle wall, following the path the groundskeepers used. I needed to think. I needed to work out what, if anything, that glance had meant, and whether I needed to be somewhere other than the eastern seamstress quarters when morning came. The logical answer was that it had meant nothing. A king's gaze sweeps a room. It lands on things. It does not necessarily mean anything that it had landed on me. I had almost convinced myself of this when I heard footsteps behind me. Not the soft, uncertain footsteps of someone wandering. Deliberate ones. Measured. The kind that belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going and had no reason to hurry, because the outcome was not in question. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped too. I turned around slowly, the way you turn when some deep instinct has already told you what you are going to find, and your body is simply catching up to what your bones already know. King Draven stood 10 feet away on the groundskeeper's path, his black fur-lined mantle shifting in the cold wind, his pale eyes on me with the same expression they had worn across the length of the great hall. Not surprised, not angry. Something harder to read than either of those. He was alone, which was wrong. Kings did not walk castle grounds alone at night. There were protocols, guards, a whole architecture of protection built around a man like him. The absence of all that should have been reassuring. Instead, it made the space between us feel strangely unguarded, as though the usual rules had been quietly suspended without anyone telling me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, in a voice that was low and unhurried and carried the kind of weight that did not need volume, "You left before the last bell." It was not a question. It was not quite an accusation. It was the opening move of something I did not yet have a name for, delivered by a man who had clearly been watching long enough to know when I had gone. My mouth was dry. My hands, tucked inside my cloak, were cold. Every sensible thought I possessed was telling me to lower my gaze, offer some murmured apology about not belonging at the ball in the first place, and walk back to the seamstress quarters as quickly as my wrong for cobblestone slippers would carry me. Instead, I heard myself say very quietly, "I was not supposed to be there at all, my Lord King." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A fraction of movement around his eyes that might, in a different face, have been the beginning of something warmer. "No," he said. "You were not." The wind moved between us, carrying pine and cold stone, and the distant echo of music from the ball that was still, apparently, continuing without either of us. "And yet," he added, "you were the only person in that hall tonight who was watching the room instead of performing for it." I had no answer for that. I was not sure an answer was what he was waiting for. He studied me for another moment, that silver gaze moving across my face with a thoroughness that made me feel simultaneously more real and less certain of my own edges. And then he said something that I would spend the next several weeks turning over in my mind like a stone that kept revealing new facets. "Come to the castle library. Tomorrow. 1 hour past dawn." He did not wait for my response. He turned and walked back the way he had come, his mantle settling around him as he went, and within moments the darkness had swallowed him as completely as though he had never been there at all. I stood on the groundskeeper's path with the cold pressing in around me, and the music still drifting faintly from the castle above. And I understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives when something has already changed, and there is no going back, that whatever invisible life I had been living inside those walls was finished. The only question left was what would come next. I did not sleep. I lay on my narrow pallet in the seamstress quarters, while Marta snored softly in the bed across the room, and the candle I had forgotten to extinguish burned itself down to a stub, and I stared at the low stone ceiling and tried to be rational about what had happened. Rational was something I was usually good at. It had served me well in Ashenwick, where feelings were an indulgence a third daughter could not afford, and it had served me better still in Castle Vordenmaar, where the wrong emotion worn too openly on the wrong face could cost a servant her position. Rational said, "A king speaks to servants sometimes. It means nothing particular." Rational said, "The library summons was likely practical." Perhaps he had noticed me near the tapestry and wished to address the breach of protocol surrounding my uninvited presence at the ball. Perhaps it was to be a quiet reprimand, and tomorrow I would return to my needle and thread, and the whole strange evening would fold back into silence. Rational said all of this very clearly, and I did not believe a word of it. Because the other thing, the thing that was not rational, the thing I kept pressing on the way a tongue presses on a tender tooth, was the way he had looked at me. Not with displeasure. Not with the flat authority of a king addressing a trespass. With something that had looked, from where I was standing, uncomfortably close to recognition. As though he had been searching a crowded room for something specific, and had, against reasonable expectation, found it. I rose before dawn. I dressed carefully, which was its own kind of admission. My everyday kirtle was plain undyed linen, serviceable and invisible. I chose instead a deep blue one that Marta had let me keep after it came back from a noble lady who declared the color no longer suited her. It fit well enough at the waist if I belted it properly, and it made my pale blonde braid look intentional rather than hasty. I studied myself in the small polished copper mirror above the washstand and told myself this meant nothing, that I was simply choosing not to appear before the king of the realm, looking as though I had slept badly in my clothes. Then I went to the library. Castle Vordenmaar's library occupied the entire upper floor of the North Tower, a long room with arched windows that looked out over the highland forest, and shelves that climbed so high they required a rolling ladder on an iron track to reach the upper volumes. The smell when I pushed open the heavy door was extraordinary. Old vellum and beeswax and the particular dusty warmth of a room that has housed knowledge for so long that the knowledge has become atmospheric, something you breathe in rather than read. I had never been inside before. Servants did not come here without reason. I stood in the doorway for a moment, adjusting to the light, which was gray and soft through the leaded windows, and fell in long, slanted bars across the reading tables. The room appeared empty. Then I heard movement near the far shelves, the sound of a heavy volume being returned to its place, and King Draven stepped into the light. He had not come armored this morning. He wore a dark linen tunic beneath a leather jerkin, his braids loosely gathered, and without the full weight of his court regalia, he looked, not less powerful, that was not quite the right word, but somehow more present, more specifically himself. The scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, which I had seen before only from a distance, was visible now, pale against his skin, a quiet record of something the court did not speak about openly. He looked at me as I entered and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You came." "You asked me to, my Lord King," I said. "I did." He moved to the nearest reading table and set down the volume he was carrying, a large leather-bound thing with brass corner fittings that looked older than anything I owned. "Most people summoned to this room assume it means trouble." "I considered that possibility," I admitted. Something crossed his face that I was beginning to recognize as the nearest he came to a smile. Not the expression itself, but its shadow, a slight alteration around his eyes. "And yet you came anyway." "If it was trouble," I said carefully, "I thought it better to face it directly than spend the day imagining it." He looked at me for a moment, in a way that felt like assessment, though not unkind. Then he gestured to the chair across from the one he settled into, an invitation that managed to be both casual and entirely clear that it was not optional. I sat, For the next hour, and it was a full hour, the light shifting through the windows as we spoke, King Draven asked me questions. Not about the ball, not about my uninvited presence at it, not about the midnight conversation in the outer courtyard. He asked me about Ashenwick, about what I had read, about whether I had opinions on the trade agreements with the eastern clans that the council had been debating for the past 3 months, which was a question so unexpectedly substantive that I answered it before I had time to decide whether I was supposed to. I did have opinions. As it turned out, I had quite specific ones, formed from 2 years of listening to castle conversations that people had in front of me because they had forgotten I was there. He listened. That was the part I could not entirely account for. He listened the way very few people in positions of power bother to, not waiting for a pause in which to speak, but actually receiving what I said, turning it, sometimes pushing back on it with a directness that was startling and oddly respectful at once. When I said something he disagreed with, he said so plainly. When I pushed back, and I did, twice, with my heart hammering because arguing with a king was not something my rational mind endorsed, he did not look offended. He looked, if anything, more focused. The council believes the Omega population of the border settlements is too disorganized to have coherent political interests, he said at one point, not as something he believed, but as something he was placing on the table between us. The council, I said, has never spent a winter in a border settlement. The shadow of a smile again, clearer this time. No, he agreed. They have not. It was only when the bells of the chapel rang the second morning hour that I became aware of how much time had passed, and became aware simultaneously of something else. That during the last portion of our conversation, I had leaned forward in my chair without noticing, my elbows on the table, my voice no longer careful and measured but simply direct, and that he had mirrored the posture without appearing to notice either. I sat back. The awareness of what I was doing, and who I was doing it with, returned all at once, and I felt color rise in my face. I have kept you from your duties, I said, which was an absurd thing to say to a king, and I knew it even as the words came out. You have, he said, with something that was definitely closer to warmth than anything that had come before it. Come again tomorrow. I opened my mouth, closed it. My Lord King, I said slowly, I am a seamstress's assistant. I have a position here that depends on... I will speak to Marta, he said simply, as though this resolved everything. And in Castle Vordenmaar it probably did. I rose and curtsied, properly this time, the way I had never felt quite entitled to before. And when I straightened, he was watching me with that same expression from the ball, from the courtyard, now close enough that I could not pretend it was something I had imagined from a distance. I left the library with my hand steady, and my thoughts anything but. In the corridor below, I nearly walked directly into Lady Seraphine. She was the eldest daughter of Lord Casvan of the Northern Reach, considered by the court to be the most probable future queen, beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, with dark hair, and the kind of composure that is really just disdain wearing better clothes. She had been the one whose gown I had repaired the night of the ball. She looked at me now with an expression that started as mild annoyance at nearly being collided with and shifted, as her eyes moved from my face to the doorway of the North Tower Library and back, into something considerably colder. What were you doing up there? She asked. Her voice was pleasant, which made it worse. Returning a volume for the head seamstress, my lady, I said, without hesitation, without blinking. She studied me for a moment. Then she smiled. The particular smile of a woman who has not quite believed you, but has decided to store the uncertainty for later, and moved past me down the corridor without another word. I waited until she was gone, before I let out a slow breath. Whatever this was, whatever these library mornings were becoming, I understood now that they would not remain invisible forever. The castle had eyes in every corridor, ears behind every tapestry, and Lady Seraphine had a talent for connecting things that others preferred to leave unconnected. I walked back to the seamstress quarters in the cold morning light, and tried very hard not to think about the way Draven's pale eyes had looked when I pushed back against his argument, and the precise quality of attention he had turned on me when I did. I failed entirely at not thinking about it. The library became mine, in a way nothing had ever been mine before. Not mine to own. I understood that clearly enough. Nothing inside Castle Vordenmaar belonged to a seamstress's assistant from Ashenwick, least of all a tower full of ancient volumes and the hour each morning spent inside it. But there is a kind of belonging that has nothing to do with ownership, and that is what those mornings gave me. A place where I was expected. A chair that came to feel like it had been arranged with me in mind. A conversation that picked up each day, exactly where it had left off the day before, as though the night between was merely a pause, rather than a separation. It went on for 3 weeks. Marta said nothing directly, which was its own form of communication. She simply stopped assigning me tasks in the early morning hours, and once, when a younger assistant named Petra asked why Josie never helped with the pre-dawn mending anymore, Marta said crisply that I had been reassigned and that Petra should mind the thread tension on Lady Adwin's sleeve and leave the rest to those who were paid to think about it. I was grateful for that silence in a way I did not know how to express, so I expressed it by doing twice the work in the remaining hours and never being late returning. The other members of the seamstress quarters had their own quiet opinions. Petra watched me with curiosity that was not yet suspicion. Old Bess, who had been at the castle since before I was born, and who knew everything about everyone within its walls, looked at me one evening across the work table with an expression that said she had already assembled the full picture and was reserving judgment. Calla, the youngest of us, barely 19 and newly arrived from the southern villages, simply asked me once what the library smelled like, and when I told her, old vellum, beeswax, the particular warmth of accumulated knowledge, she sighed as though I had described somewhere she had always wanted to go. I liked Calla. She reminded me of who I had been at her age, before I learned to make myself smaller than I actually was. Inside the library, Draven and I had moved through topics the way a river moves through different landscapes, sometimes swift and direct, sometimes slower, pooling in unexpected places. We had spoken about the Eastern Clan treaties, about the history of the Omega settlements along the border, about the old texts that described the first Alpha lines, and whether the hierarchies they established had been practical necessity or something more deliberately constructed. He had asked my opinion on a territorial dispute between 2 beta lords in the southern provinces, and when I laid out my reasoning, methodically, the way I had always processed problems privately, but had never before been invited to do aloud, he had listened with his full attention, and then said quietly that I had identified the point his council had spent 6 days failing to reach. I did not know what to do with that. So I did what I usually did with things I could not process immediately. I filed it away and kept moving. What I could not file away as easily were the smaller things. The way he always had a second cup of warmed spiced cider waiting on the table when I arrived, without ever having asked whether I wanted it. The way he had learned, by the second week, that I thought better when I was able to move slightly, and had stopped expecting me to sit entirely still, so that sometimes I stood at the window while we argued, and he tracked my movement with his eyes in a way that was patient and particular. The way he had shown me, on the 14th morning, a journal entry written by the 3rd Alpha King of Vordenmaar, 300 years prior, that described an Omega advisor whose counsel had been so precise that the king had recorded it verbatim, and the way Draven had pushed the journal across the table toward me without comment, letting me read it and reach my own conclusion about why he was showing it to me. I had reached the conclusion. I had chosen not to say it aloud. Some understandings are fragile when spoken too early. It was on the 22nd morning that things shifted. I arrived at the library at the usual hour to find it not empty and waiting but already occupied. Not by Draven alone, but by Draven and 2 men I recognized as senior members of his war council. Lord Aldrich, a broad, gray-bearded beta, with the permanent expression of a man who expects bad news and is rarely disappointed, and Commander Edrin, the head of the Royal Guard, lean and quiet, with eyes that assessed everything and showed nothing. Both of them looked at me when I entered. I stopped in the doorway. Draven looked up from the map spread across the reading table between them. Something moved through his expression, not quite apology, but acknowledgement. "Josie," he said, "come in. Close the door." I came in. I closed the door. I was aware, with the specific precision of someone who has spent years reading rooms, that Lord Aldrich's expression had shifted from assessment to something considerably less neutral, and that Commander Edrin had gone very still in the way that trained fighters go still when something unexpected enters a space they were controlling. "She is the one," Lord Aldrich said. Not to me, to Draven, as though I had not just walked through the door. "She is present," Draven said, with a mildness that had an edge under it. "Address her as such." Aldrich's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head toward me with the minimal courtesy of a man making a concession he resents. "My apologies, mistress." I said nothing. I waited. Draven gestured me to the table. I crossed the room and stood at its edge, looking down at the map, the Highland territories, the eastern clan borders, a series of marked positions I recognized as garrison placements. Someone had drawn new lines through the eastern sector in red chalk. The lines were not where the garrisons were supposed to be. "The eastern border has been compromised," Draven said. Not gently, but directly, which I had come to understand was how he delivered difficult information to people he respected. "3 of our Highland posts have gone quiet in the past fortnight. No messengers, no signal fires. The Council believes it is the Vreth clan making a territorial push." "The Council is wrong," I said, before I had finished deciding to say it. Silence. Lord Aldrich made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Commander Edrin looked at me with the first expression he had shown since I entered, which was something between surprise and reassessment. Draven looked at me with no surprise at all. "Explain," he said. I pointed to the map. "The Vreth clan's last 3 territorial expansions all moved from south to north, following the river lines, here, and here. These positions move east to west, cutting off the Highland passes rather than claiming territory. That is not expansion. That is isolation. Someone is not trying to take land. Someone is trying to prevent something from moving through it." I felt the quality of the silence change. "What would they want to prevent?" Edrin asked. His voice was careful. "A message," I said, "or a person." Draven's pale eyes had not moved from the map, but I could feel the shift in him, the particular kind of stillness that meant something had connected. He looked up at me. "There is a diplomatic envoy from the Northern Free Territories moving through those passes," he said quietly, "due to arrive within the fortnight. The arrangement has not been made public. Then someone made it public through other means," I said. Another silence. This one heavier. Lord Aldrich was looking at me now with an expression that had lost the resentment and replaced it with something more complicated. The look of a man who has been operating on a set of assumptions that have just been quietly invalidated. Commander Edrin had straightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. Draven said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Aldrich. "Recall the eastern garrison and redirect along the ridge route. Move the envoy's arrival forward by 4 days and send the confirmation through the southern messenger line, not the eastern one." Aldrich nodded slowly. "And the source of the intelligence breach?" "That," Draven said, "we will discuss separately." He looked at me. "Stay." Aldrich and Edrin gathered the map and left with the efficient quiet of men accustomed to being dismissed. When the door closed, the library returned to its usual self, vellum and beeswax and gray morning light. But the air inside it felt different now, charged with something that had not been present on any of the previous 21 mornings. Draven was looking at me from across the table. "You knew that without being told the full situation," he said. "I read patterns," I said. "I always have. In my village, it was useful for predicting which traders would cheat on weight. Here, the stakes are apparently larger." "Considerably," he said. Then, after a pause, "The council will ask where that analysis came from." I understood what he was not quite asking. Whether I was willing to be visible. Whether I was willing to step out from behind the tapestry. Not as an accident this time, not as someone who slipped into a lit room uninvited, but deliberately. I thought about Lady Seraphine in the corridor, about Marta's careful silence, about Calla asking what the library smelled like, and old Bess watching me across the work table with her reserved and knowing eyes. "What will you tell them?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "The truth," he said. "That I found someone worth listening to." The morning light through the arched windows had shifted while we spoke, brightening from gray to something warmer, and it caught the pale silver of his eyes for a moment, in a way that made them look almost luminous, and I had to look back at the map and remind myself to breathe normally. I realized with the same quiet certainty with which I had read the garrison positions, in considerably more trouble than I had previously calculated. The court found out on a Thursday. I knew at the moment I walked into the great hall to deliver the repaired ceremonial banners that Marta had assigned me. A task that would normally have been given to Petra, which told me Marta had her own reasons for wanting me visible in the hall that morning, perhaps as a kind of deliberate normalcy, a reminder to anyone watching that I was still simply a seamstress's assistant who carried folded cloth and kept her eyes down. I kept my eyes down. But I heard everything. The hall was occupied by a cluster of noble ladies, arranged near the eastern hearth with the particular studied casualness of women who have chosen their positions in a room with great deliberation. Lady Seraphine was at their center, which was where Lady Seraphine always was. Beside her sat Lady Adwin, whose sleeve Petra had been minding the thread tension on for the past week, and two younger ladies from the western provinces, whose names I had learned but whose relevance to me had previously been non-existent. They were speaking in the lowered voices that are designed to carry just far enough. "Every morning," Seraphine said, "the North Tower. Alone with him." "She is a servant," one of the western ladies said, with the tone of someone who finds the situation more amusing than threatening. "She was a servant," Seraphine said. The correction was gentle and precise, and landed like a blade finding a gap in armor. Commander Edran's second apparently redirected 3 Highland garrison units yesterday on the basis of an analysis no one in the War Council had produced. Lord Aldrich confirmed it to my father last evening. He did not name the source directly. A pause. He did not need to. I set the banners on the receiving table near the far wall, smoothed them with hands that I kept deliberately unhurried, and walked back the way I had come without looking at any of them. In the corridor, I exhaled. I had known this was coming. I had known it with the same pattern-reading clarity that had served me in the library. And I had been quietly preparing for it in the way that people who expect difficulty always prepare. Not by building walls, but by deciding in advance what they will and will not surrender. I would not surrender the mornings. I would not surrender the table and the map and the arguments and the spiced cider that was always waiting. I would not surrender the version of myself that had been quietly assembling in that North Tower room over 3 weeks of being genuinely listened to for the first time in my adult life. What I had not prepared for was Draven moving first. He summoned me that afternoon not to the library but to the council chamber, a different room entirely, larger and more formal, with high stone walls hung with the wolf sigil of House Vordenmaar, and a long oak table around which 12 chairs were arranged. 11 of those chairs were occupied when I arrived. Lord Aldrich, Commander Edran, 7 additional council members whose names I knew from castle gossip, and whose faces I had seen at distance. And in the chair at the table's head, Draven, in full court dress for the first time since the Solstice Ball. dark tunic beneath a fur-lined mantle, the iron circlet of the Alpha King across his brow. He looked different with the circlet, not more powerful. He did not need the symbol for that, but more contained, more deliberately armored, as though the formality were a kind of preparation rather than a comfort. Every face at the table turned toward me when I entered. I stood in the doorway and did not let myself look uncertain, because uncertainty was a gift I could not afford to give to this room. I found Draven's eyes across the length of the table and held them, and he gave me the smallest nod. Not of reassurance, but of acknowledgement. I'm asking something of you. I know what it costs. I walked to the empty chair at the table's foot, the one that had clearly been placed there for me. I sat down. The silence that followed was the specific silence of powerful people recalibrating. Lord Aldrich spoke first. For those unaware, he said, in a tone that suggested he had spent the morning rehearsing the precise level of neutrality required. The Eastern garrison redirection implemented yesterday was based in part on strategic analysis provided by... He paused, almost imperceptibly. Josie of Ashenwick, currently serving in the Castle seamstress quarters. I watched the faces. Lord Casvin, Seraphine's father, a broad man with the calculating eyes of someone who had spent 50 years turning every situation to advantage, showed nothing immediately, which told me he was the one to watch. A younger lord named Brennan, whose family held the southern ports, looked openly startled. The others fell somewhere between those two responses. The envoy arrived safely this morning through the ridge route, Commander Edrin said. 4 days ahead of the original schedule, the eastern passes showed evidence of organized obstruction consistent with the analysis. 3 parties attempting to intercept were rerouted by our advance riders. He paused. No confrontation occurred. A careful way of saying that what might have been a serious incident had been quietly prevented. The question before this council, Draven said, his voice carrying without effort in the stone room, is not whether the analysis was correct. It was. The question is how we formalize an asset that has been operating informally. She is a seamstress, Lord Casvin said, pleasantly. The way he would have said the sky is blue, not as an argument but as a fact he was surprised anyone had found worth discussing. She identified in 4 minutes what this council did not identify in 6 days, Draven said. Equally pleasant. Considerably less yielding. A beat of silence. With respect, my Lord King, Casvin continued. The court's perception, Draven said, is not the eastern border's primary concern. He looked around the table with the particular quality of attention that did not invite interruption. I am expanding the Council's advisory structure to include a position of Border Intelligence Council. The role will be responsible for pattern analysis on territorial communications and movement reports. He looked at me. I am offering that position to Josie of Ashenwick. The room moved. Not physically, but something in the collective atmosphere shifted, the way air shifts before a storm. I kept my breathing even. I thought about Ashenwick, about the wool merchant's 3rd daughter, who would not inherit, would not lead, would not matter much in the larger arrangements of the world. I thought about 2 years of being usefully invisible in castle corridors. I thought about Calla asking what the library smelled like. I accept, I said. Several things happened quickly after that. Lord Brennan leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone deciding this situation might be interesting after all. Lord Casvin's pleasant expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. Commander Edrin looked at me with the direct, evaluating look of a man updating his assessment of a situation he had previously considered settled. And Lord Aldrich, gray-bearded, perpetually expecting bad news, who had told Draven in the library 3 weeks ago that I was the one, with a tone that had suggested he was not certain this was wise, looked at me across the length of the oak table and said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing words that will outlast the moment, "Welcome to the council, my lady. My lady." I had never been called that before. I was not a noble. I was not, by any formal classification, a lady. The title was premature and technically incorrect, and I felt it land somewhere in the center of my chest like something warm, pressing against a place that had been cold for a very long time. The meeting proceeded for another hour. I spoke twice more, once to clarify a point about the messenger line compromise that Edron raised, and once to suggest a verification system for future diplomatic communications that used variable courier routes rather than fixed ones. Both times the room listened in the particular way that rooms listen when they are still deciding whether to believe what they are hearing. When the council dispersed, Draven remained at the table. So did I. When the last council member had gone and the heavy door had closed, he looked at me from across the long oak expanse and said, "That was not a small thing I asked of you." "No," I agreed. "Casven will move against it, not immediately. He will find a procedural argument, or he will work through Seraphine, or he will wait and build a coalition." He said it without drama, the way he said most things, as information to be worked with rather than feared. "It will become complicated. Things that matter usually do," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You are not frightened?" It was not quite a question. I considered giving him the easy answer, which was that I was steady and capable, and had chosen this with clear eyes. Instead, I gave him the true one. "I'm frightened," I said. "I have been frightened since the night of the ball when you looked at me across a room full of people, and I understood that being invisible was no longer available to me." I paused. "But I have also been a great many things in my life that were harder than frightening, and I managed those. I expect I will manage this." Something crossed his face then. Something that moved through his expression the way dawn moves. Slow, and then all at once, and was gone before I could name it precisely, but left the room feeling different in its wake. He rose from his chair, and I rose from mine, and we stood at opposite ends of the long table in the council chamber, with the late afternoon light falling through the high windows and the wolf sigil watching from the walls. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "the library." "I will be there," I said. I walked back to the seamstress quarters as the castle bells rang the evening hour, passing 3 separate clusters of courtiers who went quiet as I moved through them, and I kept my eyes ahead, and my pace unhurried, and my chin at exactly the angle it needed to be. Old Bess was the only one still at the work table when I returned. She looked up from her mending, studied my face for a moment with those knowing eyes, and then said simply, "Sit down. Girl, I saved you supper." I sat down. For the first time in a very long while, the seamstress quarters felt not like the place I had been assigned, but the place I was choosing to return to. That, I thought, was its own kind of power. Lord Casven moved against me on the 40th day. I had expected it. I had been tracking the signs the way I tracked everything, quietly, from the edges, assembling the pattern before it declared itself. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a corridor. The formal complaint submitted to the council scribe, questioning the procedural legitimacy of a non-noble appointment to an advisory role. The invitation that arrived for every council member except me to a private supper in Lord Casven's chambers, which was not subtle enough to be anything other than deliberate. And then, on the 40th morning, Lady Seraphine came to the library. I was already at the table when she entered. A scroll of Eastern Messenger reports opened before me, and the second cup of spiced cider steaming gently at my elbow. Draven had stepped out briefly to speak with Commander Edron in the corridor. The timing of Seraphine's arrival suggested she had been watching for exactly that gap. She was dressed beautifully, as she always was. Deep green wool, her dark hair arranged with the precision of someone who understands that appearance is its own argument. She closed the door behind her and looked at me across the library with an expression that had abandoned pleasantness entirely in favor of something more honest, which I found I respected more. "You are not naive," she said. "So I will not pretend this is a social call. I did not think it was. I said. She moved to the window and stood with the gray morning light behind her, which was a good choice. It made her harder to read. My father intends to bring a formal motion before the full council next week. He has 4 votes secured already. He needs 6 to compel the king to review your appointment under the noble advisory statutes. He needs 7, I said. The statutes require a 2/3 majority on advisory challenges. There are 12 council seats. 7 is 2/3. A pause. Something shifted in her expression. Not defeat, but recalculation. You have read the statutes. I have read everything in this library, I said. I have had 40 mornings. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she moved away from the window and sat, without invitation, in the chair across from mine, Draven's chair, with the composure of a woman who has decided to change her approach mid-conversation. What do you want? She asked, directly, woman to woman, with the procedural pretense set aside. I considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. To be useful, I said, to do work that matters, to not be invisible. I paused. The same things I imagine that you want. We have simply been handed different tools for wanting them. Something moved through her face that was complicated and brief, and more human than anything I had seen from her before. She looked down at the table, then back at me. He has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you, she said. It was not spoken with bitterness exactly, more with the particular tiredness of someone releasing a weight they had been carrying for longer than was wise. I spent 2 years arranging to be looked at that way. It never worked. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was sometimes the most honest response available. My father will still bring the motion, she said, rising. I cannot stop him, but I will not add my voice to it. She moved toward the door, and then paused with her hand on the iron handle. For what it is worth, the analysis on the eastern passes was correct. One of my father's outriders confirmed it independently. He has not told the council that. She left. I sat with that information for exactly as long as it took Draven to return, and then I told him everything she had said, because that was the only way I knew how to operate in this place, with complete honesty to the one person who had offered me the same. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Casvin's outrider confirmation changes the procedural landscape entirely. If he has suppressed supporting evidence for a council motion, that is a violation of the advisory charter. Yes, I said. I thought so too. He looked at me across the table with those pale silver eyes, and I looked back, and there was a moment, unhurried and exact, in which something that had been building for 40 mornings arrived quietly at its destination without announcement. Josie, he said. Not my Lord King, not a summons, not a directive. Just my name in his voice, in that room that smelled of vellum and beeswax, with the morning light, doing what morning light does when it has decided to be generous. Yes, I said, before he had finished whatever he had been about to say. He stopped. Something in his expression shifted into the warmth that had always lived just beneath the surface of him, the warmth that the court never saw, because the court was never still enough or honest enough to deserve it. I have not asked the question yet. You have been asking it for 40 days, I said. In the way you listen, in the second cup of cider, in the journal entry about the Omega advisor that you pushed across the table on the 14th morning. I paused. I have been answering it for approximately the same amount of time. I thought we had both understood each other. A beat of silence, and then Draven laughed. A real laugh, brief and low. The kind that comes from a place that does not get used often enough. And it changed his face entirely. And I understood in that moment, that this was the version of him that existed beneath the iron and the silver circlet, and the silence, and that I was one of very few people who would ever see it. "Then I will ask it formally," he said, "so that there is no ambiguity." He held my gaze steadily. "Will you stay? Not as an advisor, not as a council appointment. As someone who belongs here, beside me, because you choose to, not because a position requires it." "I choose to," I said. Lord Casvan's motion came before the council 5 days later. Draven presented the charter violation, the suppressed outrider report, before Casvan had finished his opening argument. Commander Edrin provided the documentation. The chamber went very quiet. The motion collapsed before it reached a vote. Lord Casvan resigned from the council before the week was out, retreating to his northern estates with the particular dignity of a man who has lost and knows it, and intends to pretend otherwise at a safe distance. Seraphine remained at court. She and I were never friends, precisely, but we reached the kind of understanding that is sometimes more durable than friendship. A mutual respect between two women who had both been told the world had a fixed shape, and had both, in different ways, refused to accept it entirely. The seasons turned. Autumn came to Castle Vordenmaar in amber and cold wind, and the highland forest outside the North Tower windows went gold and then bare. The council restructured, with 2 new appointments that Draven made carefully, with my input on the border settlements that most of them had never visited. Commander Edrin and I developed the variable courier system I had proposed, and it held through 2 more diplomatic arrangements without incident. Old Bess retired to a cottage near the southern gate, and Calla was promoted to head the seamstress quarters, which she did with quiet capability, and a warmth that the other women responded to immediately. Marta cried at the announcement, which she would have denied if anyone mentioned it. Petra, to her credit, adapted. On the first day of winter, in the great hall of Castle Vordenmaar, before the assembled court and council, Draven spoke my name aloud in the formal register and extended his hand across the space between us. And I took it, and the wolf sigil watched from every wall as the Alpha King of Vordenmaar and the wool merchant's 3rd daughter from Ashenwick stood side by side in front of everyone who had ever looked through me and made something official that had been true for much longer than the ceremony required. Lord Aldrich, who had expected bad news every day for 30 years and had not received any today, stood at the front of the assembly, with an expression that was as close to moved as his face knew how to get. Draven's hand was warm around mine, and his pale eyes were on my face, and the hall was loud with voices, and beneath all of it was the particular silence of 2 people who had already said everything important to each other in a room that smelled of vellum and beeswax, and knew that the ceremony was simply the world catching up to what they had already decided. That night, long after the celebration had quieted and the torches had burned low, I stood at the North Tower library window and looked out at the highland forest. Dark and vast, and breathing the way it always had, the way it had breathed before the castle was built upon this hill, and would breathe long after. Draven came to stand beside me. We did not speak for a while. We did not need to. "Do you miss it?" he asked eventually, "being invisible?" I thought about it honestly, the way I thought about everything when I was in this room. I thought about the girl who had stood behind tapestries and made herself small and learned to want only what could not be taken away. I thought about what it had cost her, and what it had quietly taught her, and what she had carried out of it that turned out to be worth more than she had known. "No," I said, "but I am grateful to her. She kept everything safe until I knew what to do with it." He was quiet for a moment. Then his hand found mine at the windowsill. Unhurried, certain, the way he did everything. And we stood together looking out at the forest and the dark and the cold winter stars above the highland trees. The library was warm behind us. The castle was settled and alive around us. Somewhere below, Calla was probably still awake, mending something by candlelight and thinking about the shape of the world, and whether it might be larger than she had been told. I hoped, with everything in me, that she would find out. This story was always going to end here. Not with a battle, not with a grand pronouncement, but with a window and a hand and the quiet knowledge that the life you are living is exactly the one you chose. That is the kind of ending that does not need anything after it. It was enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything.